The study was the only place in the house that felt like it belonged to me. Even though it wasn't mine, nothing in that grand villa truly was. It became my refuge the moment I discovered it. The shelves climbed the walls, stacked with books in different languages, some older than me, some so new their spines barely creaked when opened. Heavy drapes softened the light, and the air smelled faintly of parchment and cedar. When I slipped inside, closing the door gently behind me, it felt as if the world outside, the clinking of glasses, the murmurs of my father's guests, couldn't follow me in. I was turning the pages of a book I had chosen at random, more to hide in its silence than to actually read it, when the door opened again. I didn't hear footsteps first, only the click of the latch, soft but deliberate. I lifted my head, expecting perhaps a servant, or my father searching for me. But it wasn't either of them. It was him. Sheikh. I had noticed him long before that night, of course. My father's acquaintance, though that word seemed far too light for the respect he carried. He was the kind of man whose arrival changed a room without effort. Older than me, though I didn't know by how much. His face was sharp yet calm, the kind of calm that wasn't emptiness but control. When he spoke at dinner, the others leaned in, though he rarely raised his voice. And now he was here in the study looking at me. I sat upright, my hand tightening around the book as though it could shield me. He didn't announce himself. He didn't apologize for entering. He simply stepped inside, closing the door with quiet certainty as though the room belonged to him. For a moment, neither of us said anything. He walked across the carpeted floor, his robe brushing against the fabric with a sound so subtle it only made the silence heavier. He touched the edge of the desk as he passed it, his fingers lingering on the polished wood like he was grounding himself. "You prefer the quiet," he said at last. His voice was deep, slow, carrying with it the steadiness of someone who rarely wasted words. I nodded quickly, my throat dry. "It helps me think." His eyes held mine for a moment, dark and steady. It was only a second, maybe two, but it felt longer. I looked down again, pretending to scan the page, though the words blurred before me. My pulse betrayed me, quickening in my chest. He didn't sit right away. He moved around the room slowly, his gaze passing over the shelves, the rug, the window, and then returning to me. Always returning to me. When he finally settled, it was not across the room as I had expected, but near, on the edge of the desk, just a few steps away. His posture was relaxed but deliberate, his hands folded lightly in his lap. He wasn't pretending to read. He wasn't pretending to be occupied with anything else. He was watching me. I tried to act unaffected, but the air felt different, as though it had thickened between us. My breaths were shallow. Every rustle of the page sounded louder than it should have. The strangest part was that his gaze didn't feel like scrutiny. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't even searching for something specific. It was considering. As though he was seeing me, really seeing me for the first time. I remembered earlier that evening at the dinner table, when I caught him watching me across the candles. I had looked away quickly then, embarrassed, telling myself it was nothing. But now, here in the quiet, I couldn't dismiss it so easily. Minutes passed like that, neither of us speaking, the silence between us alive with something unnamed. I turned another page, though I couldn't have repeated a single line. The book trembled slightly in my hands, and I willed myself to keep them steady. When I dared to glance up again, his eyes were waiting. He didn't look away this time. He didn't even blink. My stomach tightened. There was no smile on his face, no frown either, just that calm, unwavering attention that left me more unsettled than any expression could. It was too much. I lowered my gaze again, but the image of his eyes lingered, burning behind mine. Eventually he rose. The sound of fabric moving broke the tension, though only slightly. He walked toward the door without a word, his steps unhurried, deliberate. He opened it as quietly as he had entered, and for a moment he stood in the threshold, glancing back over his shoulder. Our eyes met one last time, brief but heavy, and then he was gone. The study was silent again, but not the same. The walls, the shelves, even the chair I sat in felt altered, as if his presence had seeped into them. I closed the book slowly, my hands still tingling, my chest still tight. Nothing had been spoken, not really. Nothing had happened, not truly. And yet, I knew. Something had shifted. That night, when I finally left the study and returned to my room, I lay awake long after the house had gone still. The echo of his gaze haunted me, steady and unrelenting. It was only the beginning, but already, it felt like the night had changed something I could never quite change back. The following evening, I told myself I wouldn't go back to the study. I tried to linger in the courtyard after dinner, listening to the splash of the fountain and the laughter of the guests drifting from the hall. I even carried a book to my room, determined to read there, away from the place where the silence had felt too charged, too alive. But habits are hard to break, especially the kind that feel like gravity. By the time the house quieted, my footsteps were already carrying me back down the hallway, past the closed doors, toward the room that had become something more than a refuge. When I opened the study door, I half expected him to already be there. But the room was empty, the air still, the books waiting. I exhaled a shaky breath and sat in the same chair by the window, setting my book on my lap. For a few minutes, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it all, that last night's intensity was nothing more than my mind playing tricks, weaving stories out of glances. Then the latch clicked. He entered again. Silently. My heart leapt before I even turned my head. There was no hesitation in him, no sign of surprise at finding me there. He closed the door softly and crossed the floor with the same measured grace as before. But this time, instead of pausing at the desk or circling the shelves, he came directly to me. He stopped just in front of my chair. The closeness startled me. I had grown used to watching him from a distance, not from barely an arm's reach. My breath caught. "You return?" he said quietly. I nodded, forcing my eyes back to the book. "It's quiet here." He studied me for a long moment. I could feel his gaze even without looking at him. Then he lowered himself into the chair across from me, folding his robe neatly, his movements deliberate. The silence stretched. I tried to focus on the words before me, but the letters blurred. I could feel him there, his presence heavier than any sound. "You read," he said finally, his tone low, almost amused, "but you do not turn the page." My head snapped up, startled. Heat rushed to my face. He was right. I hadn't moved past the same sentence in minutes. I closed the book, embarrassed. "You noticed." His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. "I notice more than you think." The air between us shifted. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't casual either. Something tightened in my chest, a mixture of nerves and something else I couldn't name. I set the book aside, my hands restless in my lap. That's when I realized his hand was resting on the arm of my chair. Not touching me, just there. Close enough that if I shifted even slightly, our fingers might brush. And suddenly the silence wasn't empty. It was full. I couldn't think about the book anymore. I couldn't think about anything except the distance between our hands, so small, so impossible to ignore. I didn't dare move, afraid that if I did, it would either close the gap or break it entirely. I glanced at him and he was already looking at me. His eyes were steady, unreadable, but they held me in place. My breath faltered. Minutes passed, though they felt longer. Neither of us moved, but the tension grew, thick and undeniable. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. That it was coincidence, proximity, the kind of closeness born from accident. But my body knew better. The hairs on my arms stood on end, my skin alive with awareness. It was too much. Too close. Too deliberate. Finally, he withdrew his hand, resting it back in his lap. The air seemed to release, but the absence stung. I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding my breath. He leaned back slightly, studying me with that same unreadable calm. And yet, behind it, I thought I caught something else. Something restrained, something waiting. The room returned to silence. But it was not the same silence as before. It carried weight now, memory. I picked up the book again, though I didn't open it. My fingers pressed against the cover as if I needed something to hold on to. Across from me he remained still, his eyes steady on me until I felt I couldn't bear it anymore. That night, when he finally rose and left the study, the echo of his nearness stayed behind. My skin still tingled where his hand had almost touched mine. My heart still beat faster than it should have. I told myself nothing had happened. But deep down I knew the truth. It was too close to be nothing. The next day I did everything I could to avoid him. I lingered in the courtyard longer than usual, pretending to admire the fountain. I offered to help in the kitchen, though I was terrible at it. At lunch, I sat further down the table, listening to conversations that had nothing to do with me. And yet, no matter how carefully I kept my distance, his presence tugged at me like an unseen thread. When he entered a room, I felt it before I saw him. My chest tightened, my thoughts scattered. I told myself it was easier not to meet his eyes. But by nightfall, my steps betrayed me again. The study waited as it always did, quiet, patient, smelling faintly of old wood and paper. I slipped inside and told myself I would read this time, really read, as if the act could anchor me. I had only been there a few minutes when the door opened. He came in silently, as though he knew I would be there. No surprise crossed his face when he saw me. He simply closed the door and moved across the room, his robe whispering against the carpet. This time he didn't sit across from me. He walked behind my chair, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence at my back. My shoulders tensed, my grip on the book tightening. I couldn't see him, but I felt every second of his nearness. The silence pressed around us. It wasn't empty. It was full, so full it was deafening. I turned a page without knowing what was written on it. My breaths came shallow, the rise and fall of my chest far too obvious in the stillness. He stayed there behind me as if waiting. Finally, I closed the book, unable to pretend anymore. My fingers rested on the cover, trembling slightly. I leaned back in the chair, not fully but just enough that my shoulder brushed the air where he stood. That was when I felt it. His hand, light, cautious, resting on my shoulder. It was the barest touch, almost nothing. It could have been accidental. But it wasn't. It lingered. His palm was warm, steady, grounding me even as it unsettled me. I froze, every nerve in my body alive. My breath caught and I closed my eyes for just a moment. "Are you at peace here?" he asked quietly, his voice low, close to my ear. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Yes," I whispered. Then, after a pause I hadn't meant to let happen, I added, "With you here, it feels different." The words slipped out before I could stop them. My heart pounded in the silence that followed. I almost wished I could take them back, but I couldn't, not when they were truer than anything I had ever said. He didn't answer right away. His hand remained on my shoulder, steady, firm but not heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "Different," he repeated as though tasting the word. I turned slightly, just enough to glance up at him. His eyes met mine, dark and unguarded in a way I hadn't seen before. There was no mask of composure, no careful distance. Only something raw, something I didn't dare name. We stayed like that, locked in silence, until the air itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, slowly, deliberately, he withdrew his hand. The absence burned. My shoulder felt colder without him. I wanted to reach up, to hold the warmth there, but I didn't move. He stepped back a pace, his expression guarded again, though his eyes still held mine. I couldn't find words. My throat ached with them, but none came. He inclined his head slightly, almost a bow, then turned toward the shelves as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. The air between us had changed and we both felt it. I opened the book again, though I didn't see a single word. My fingers pressed hard into the cover, holding it like a secret. When he finally left the study that night, the silence remained behind, heavy and alive. Nothing had been confessed. Nothing had been promised. But something had shifted, undeniable, irreversible. I sat in the chair long after he was gone, staring at the stillness around me. It was there, in the quiet, that I understood. Sometimes silence spoke louder than words. And whatever it had said tonight, it had changed everything. It happened on the fourth night. I hadn't meant to fall asleep in the study. I told myself I'd only stay for a short while, only long enough to finish a chapter before returning to my room. But the quiet, the low lamplight, and the comfort of the chair lulled me. Somewhere between one page and the next, my eyes grew heavy, and the words slipped into blur. When I stirred awake, the room was still cloaked in its soft hush. The first thing I noticed wasn't the book slipping from my lap, but the warmth along my arm. I blinked and there he was. Sheikh sat beside me, closer than ever before, his profile half lit by the lamp. His hand rested lightly on my forearm, steady, protective. His gaze wasn't on me, it was on the book sliding against my chest as though he had been guarding it from falling. For a moment I didn't move. I stayed still, my breath caught, afraid that any shift might break the spell. The weight of his hand was both grounding and electric, sending sparks racing up my skin. My body betrayed me, leaning almost imperceptibly into his touch. When my eyes finally opened fully, he noticed. His head turned and our gazes locked. He didn't move his hand. I expected him to startle, to withdraw, to cloak himself in the same composure he always wore. But he didn't. His eyes searched mine, calm but unguarded, as though waiting for me to flinch, to push him away, to say something that would undo the moment. I couldn't. My chest rose and fell too quickly, but I stayed there, his hand on my arm, the closeness between us louder than any sound. The silence stretched, thick with all the words we hadn't spoken. His thumb moved, not much, not even a full stroke, but just enough to brush against my sleeve. A small gesture, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to ask him why. Why he was here. Why his hand lingered. Why he looked at me as though I was something he hadn't meant to find. But the questions tangled on my tongue, unspoken. Instead, I whispered the only thing that came to me. You stayed. His lips parted as though he hadn't expected me to speak at all. He hesitated, his gaze flickering downward before returning to me. I should not have, he said quietly. And yet, the unfinished sentence hung in the air between us, heavier than if he had spoken it aloud. For a long time neither of us moved. The book slipped further, finally tumbling onto the carpet, but neither of us bent to retrieve it. All that mattered was the warmth of his hand, the quiet in his eyes, the fragile thread binding us in that moment. When he finally withdrew, it was slow, reluctant. The loss was immediate, sharp, like the sting of cool air against skin once warmed. My arm tingled where his hand had been, the ghost of his touch refusing to fade. He sat back, his expression carefully neutral now, though the faintest tension lingered in his jaw. "Forgive me," he murmured. I shook my head too quickly. "There's nothing to forgive." But he didn't respond. He looked away toward the shelves, toward the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. For the first time I saw unease in him, not weakness but something far more human. I wanted to reach for him then, to give back what he had given me without asking. But my hand stayed in my lap, heavy, bound by hesitation. The silence returned, but it was not empty. It carried his touch with it, echoing long after it was gone. Eventually he rose. His robe fell in soft folds as he crossed the room, his steps measured. At the door he paused, his hand resting on the frame. Without turning he said quietly, "Some things should remain unspoken." And then he left. The study swallowed me again, but I was no longer alone. Not truly. His touch lingered, etched into my skin, into my memory, into something deeper I couldn't name. I sat there, staring at the empty chair beside me, the fallen book at my feet, my chest aching with something I had no word for. Nothing had been confessed. Nothing had been promised. But nothing would ever be the same again. Because sometimes a touch was not just a touch. Sometimes it stayed long after it was gone. The next evening I entered the study with my heart already racing. I told myself it was foolish to expect anything. That the hand on my arm the night before had been an accident, or at most a moment of weakness he would never repeat. I told myself he would stay away now, that he would retreat behind the careful distance of dignity and silence. But deep down I knew he wouldn't. And I knew I would be waiting. The room felt different from the start. The books, the lamp, even the air seemed charged with memory. I sat in the chair by the window again, my hand brushing over the place on my sleeve where his touch had lingered. The door opened. Quiet, inevitable. He entered, and this time there was no pause at the threshold. He closed the door behind him, turning the key in the lock with a soft click that sent a shiver down my spine. A deliberate choice. He didn't take the opposite chair, nor did he stand behind me. Instead, he moved to the desk and leaned against it, only a breath away from where I sat. His robe brushed against my arm, the fabric whispering between us. The silence was unbearable. My throat was dry, my hands restless in my lap. I could feel his gaze on me, steady, searching. Finally he broke it. "Does it trouble you?" His voice was low, almost uncertain. I lifted my eyes, startled. "What do you mean?" His expression didn't change, but something in his tone trembled. "The time we spend here. The way we sit, too close. Does it trouble you?" I swallowed hard, my pulse racing in my ears. The truth rose before I could stop it. "No." He studied me, his eyes narrowing slightly as though measuring my words. "It doesn't feel like nothing," I added, the words spilling out softer than I intended. The silence that followed was heavier than any confession. His breath caught, just faintly, but I heard it. His hand, resting on the desk, curled slightly against the wood. For the first time since I had known him, he looked unsure. Slowly, deliberately, his fingers reached toward mine. They brushed the back of my hand, fragile, tentative, as though asking permission without words. I didn't move. I didn't pull away. My breath shook as our skin touched, the warmth of his fingers seeping into me. It wasn't a grip, not even a hold, just the lightest brush. But it felt like more than anything I had ever known. I looked up and his eyes met mine. This time I didn't look away. The weight of that gaze was too much, too honest, too raw. I felt exposed, seen in a way I had never let anyone see me. My chest ached with it. "What are we doing?" I whispered. The question wasn't accusation, it was plea. He exhaled slowly, his hand trembling faintly against mine. "I don't know." His voice was quiet, unsteady, as though it cost him to admit it. We sat like that, hands barely touching, silence speaking louder than words. The urge to close the distance nearly overwhelmed me. To take his hand fully in mine, to lean forward, to erase the space between us. But I didn't. I couldn't. The fear of breaking whatever fragile bond held us was stronger than the desire to claim it. So instead I let it be what it was. The touch. The silence. The weight of everything unspoken. His fingers brushed mine once more before retreating, the absence immediate and sharp. He looked away, his jaw tight as though steadying himself. But the look in his eyes when he turned back told me everything. It wasn't nothing. It never had been. And for the first time, I let myself ask the question that had been waiting all along, quiet but insistent. What if this is real? The nights blurred together after that. It was no longer about the books or even the study itself. It was about the hours spent in his company, the quiet, the nearness, the rhythm we had fallen into without ever naming it. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. Our silences had become a language of their own. Some nights he would arrive first, already seated when I slipped in. Other nights I would be waiting, pretending to read while listening for the quiet click of the latch. Either way, by the end of the evening we would be together, sharing the same pool of lamplight, our bodies drawn into each other's orbit. The air between us softened. It wasn't tense anymore, not like before. It was tender. Like we had both accepted something, even if we hadn't spoken it aloud. I began to notice the little things. The way his robe would shift when he leaned forward, brushing against my sleeve. The way his breathing slowed when I sat beside him. The way his gaze softened whenever I glanced up and caught him watching me. One night, I let myself lean back in my chair, tilting my head until it rested against the cushion. He was sitting closer than usual, almost shoulder to shoulder. The lamplight cast his profile in gold, the sharp lines of his face softened by the glow. Without thinking, I let my head tilt just slightly toward him. Not enough to touch. Just enough to show I wasn't afraid to close the distance. He didn't move away. Instead, his hand lifted, slow, hesitant, as though every second gave him a chance to reconsider. His fingers brushed a strand of hair from my forehead, tucking it gently back. The touch was careful, almost reverent, and when his hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary, I felt my entire body soften in relief. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I had been waiting for it, for him. The truth hit me quietly, like a tide that had been rising all along. I didn't know I was waiting. But I had been. My eyes fluttered shut, just for a heartbeat, letting the warmth of his hand sink into me. When I opened them again, he was watching me closely, his expression unreadable but his eyes impossibly tender. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. The touch said everything. He lowered his hand slowly, deliberately, as though reluctant to break the contact. The air between us hummed with something sacred, fragile. For the rest of the night, we didn't move apart. Our arms rested close enough that the fabric of our sleeves brushed now and then, each contact sending a quiet rush through me. We said nothing about it, but neither of us pulled away. At one point, I dared to stretch my hand onto the arm of the chair, closer to him than before. Not touching, just there, open, waiting. I felt him notice. His eyes flickered down, then back up to mine. He didn't take my hand, but he didn't move away either. And somehow, that restraint was its own kind of intimacy, like we both understood that this was enough for now. We lingered until the first light of dawn began to filter faintly through the drapes. Neither of us wanted to leave, but eventually he rose, his movements unhurried, deliberate. At the door he paused, his hand resting on the frame. His voice was low, softer than I had ever heard it. Sleep well. It was such a simple phrase, yet in that moment it carried more weight than any declaration could. When he left, I stayed behind, sitting in the chair with my hand still resting where it had been, still tingling with the ghost of his touch. I thought about the strand of hair he had brushed away, about the tenderness in his eyes, about the closeness that had felt less like danger now and more like belonging. I didn't know what this was or what it might become. But I knew this. I hadn't been waiting for an answer or even for a confession. I had been waiting for him. And now that he was here, I couldn't imagine wanting anything else. The night stretched on longer than any before. We sat together in the study, side by side, neither reading nor speaking, content to let the silence cradle us. The lamplight burned low, flickering against the spines of old books. I didn't feel the hours slipping by, I only felt him there, close enough that I could sense the rhythm of his breathing, steady and grounding. At some point I stopped pretending to hold a book. I set it aside and leaned back in the chair, my body easing into stillness. He did the same, his hand resting openly on the arm of his chair, so close to mine that the warmth of him seeped across the narrow space. Time felt suspended, as though the rest of the house, the world itself, had fallen away. When the first hint of dawn crept through the curtains, pale and fragile, I turned my head to him. He was already looking at me. Neither of us looked away. I don't know what made me do it, courage or desperation or the simple truth that I couldn't keep pretending. Slowly, carefully, I slid my hand toward his until my fingers touched his knuckles. He didn't move. For a moment I thought he would retreat, pull back into the safety of silence. But then, with a quiet certainty that made my chest ache, his hand turned beneath mine. Our fingers laced together, fitting as if they had been waiting for this all along. The world shifted. Everything stilled. We sat there, hand in hand, as the light grew brighter, softening the shadows. I felt his thumb brush lightly against my skin, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed, but not by me. To me it was everything. "I didn't expect this," I whispered, afraid my voice might break the spell. His eyes softened, and for the first time, I heard something unguarded in his tone. "Nor I." The honesty in his words hit me harder than any confession could have. We didn't talk about what it meant. We didn't talk about what would happen tomorrow or the day after, or whether this was something we were allowed. The silence held those questions for us, and for once I didn't feel the need to answer them. I only knew that this moment was real, that he was here, that I was no longer alone in what I felt. We stayed like that as the room filled slowly with light, our hands joined, our breaths quiet. The study, once a refuge from the world, had become something else entirely, a place where the world began. Eventually he stood, drawing me gently to my feet with him. His hand lingered in mine a moment longer before he released it. I almost reached to take it back, but I didn't. There was no rush. The rest of the house was beginning to stir. Footsteps faint in the corridors, the scent of coffee drifting faintly on the air. But here in this room time still felt ours. He glanced at me, his expression calm but his eyes tender. Breakfast. The word was so ordinary, so simple that it nearly undid me. As though what had happened between us was not a secret to be hidden, but something that could quietly live, woven into the rhythm of everyday life. I nodded, my throat tight. Yes. We left the study together, walking down the hallway side by side. The sunlight spilling through the high windows felt different that morning, brighter, warmer, as though it knew something had changed. At the table, the others greeted us as if nothing were different. And perhaps to them nothing was. But beneath the surface, beneath the glances we shared when no one else was looking, everything had shifted. Later, when I sat alone in my room, I pressed my hand to my chest where his thumb had brushed mine, where his presence still lingered. The weight of it filled me, not heavy, not frightening, but steady, certain. I didn't know what this was. I didn't know what it might become, or whether it had a place in the world beyond the walls of the study. But I knew this, I didn't want to undo it. Not for anything. Because sometimes, in the quiet, when you're not looking for it, something finds you anyway. Something you didn't expect, didn't ask for, but needed all the same. And whatever this was, whatever it became, I was ready to carry it.